At a time when so many of us feel like our connections with people are distant and conversations are surface level, really engaging with each other takes intention. I'm Ashley Gould, the founder of Attend, an elevated, everyday home brand with products that set the table for meaningful spaces and gatherings. Our podcast builds on those spaces through dynamic discussions with open-hearted people, with the goal of sparking conversation around your table. From September through the end of the year, we'll be exploring one of the most universal and unspoken subjects, death and dying. Very few of us know how to prepare for, talk about, and support others through end of life. In this 8-part series, I interview guests whose personal lives and professions are intimately tied to the subject. Join me in an exploration of how to find more peace in preparing for death. It's my pleasure to welcome Laura Sullivan Cassidy to On the Table with Ashley. Laura is the client experience lead at Recompose, a death care company based in Seattle, Washington, focusing her work there on outreach, community, and client experience. Recompose offers a sustainable alternative to traditional burial and cremation methods and is the first human composting company in the world. Laura has a diverse background in journalism, the arts, and culture, having worked as a writer, editor, and creative consultant for over 20 years. She is trained as a death doula and draws on experience in a conventional funeral home, as well as years of creative consulting and coaching. Her transition into grief and death care began in 2020, inspired by personal losses and a desire to support others through end-of-life processes. Recompose specializes in human composting, also known as natural organic reduction, or NOR, which transforms human remains into soil. This process allows for a more environmentally friendly approach to death care by returning the body to the earth in a natural and ecologically responsible way. Recompose emphasizes sustainability, reducing carbon footprints, and promoting soil health. The company's mission is to provide a meaningful and regenerative option for handling human remains, helping families and communities honor their loved ones while contributing positively to the environment. You can find Recompose at www.recompose.life, on Instagram and Facebook at Recompose Life, and LinkedIn at Recompose. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me today. So I always like to start my podcast by asking a little bit about my guest's childhood. So could you just share where you grew up and what kind of kid you were, what you liked to do when you were young?
Sure. Yeah, I grew up in a really beautiful place. I'm in Seattle right now. Recompose is located in Seattle. And I grew up about an hour and a half north of here in a lovely little town called Anacortes, which is known to many, many more as the years go on and it becomes more discovered as the gateway to the San Juan Islands. And my dad was a marine biologist growing up, so we very much used the fact that we were on an island and that we had this beautiful world of ocean water around us. And I liked to read when I was a kid. I was outdoors. I was having fun. I was camping and playing and riding my bike, but given a chance, I was inside reading. A joke in our family is that my mom would sometimes have to say, "Don't you want to watch TV like all the other kids?" Because, what parent encourages their child to watch TV? But I was very busy reading. Yeah.
I also love to read. Do you still love to read?
Absolutely. Yeah. This summer, I'm already kind of off to the races. You as an adult, you wax and wane a bit with it. And this summer, I've been reading so much. In fact, I'm reminded of my childhood summers where I would enter every reading contest at the library. And it's one of the only places that I get kind of competitive is like, I bet I can read more books than you this summer. So.
Well, at the end, I'm going to ask for some resources. So maybe you can tell us some of your
Oh, yeah.
current favorite books.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what experiences sparked your career in journalism and then 20 years later pivoting into death care?
Yeah. I think one of the reasons I was naturally such a reader is that I am naturally a writer as well, and somebody who's just very driven to understand and intersect with as many kind of human experiences as I can. And so journalism came naturally for me, but it wasn't when I studied. I studied social work and thought that I wanted to do that. I did it for some years when I was living in New York and found it really difficult. And when I moved back to the Northwest, I did sort of fall into journalism, but it was a very natural place for me. And it served me well for many years. And I went from journalism into more a sort of content strategy kind of role and worked in startups and just thinking about how does this entity tell its stories and what are its stories, and it kind of burnt out on all of that. And at a certain point was kind of treading water a little bit and doing some consulting, which turned into doing some coaching, which turned into doing some grief coaching, because I had around that time also been through some really impactful deaths and had a lot of questions around how we do and don't help each other through grief. And a couple of the avenues that I tried to take for working through my own grief were surprising and frustrating to me, and very, like, I would describe them now as kind of male. And I actually don't mean male. I guess I mean masculine. They were very like right angled and like yes or no. And like you had to achieve something and you had to figure these things out. And I thought, well, that's not really helpful. And so I was really just kind of a student of that whole realm and kind of empowered myself to cobble together the things that I was learning, both in positive psychology and coaching and grief recovery, as it's sometimes called, and offer my own of grief coaching, which I did. And every time I did it, I was just it felt really good and it felt really interesting. And I wanted to do more in that realm. And eventually I was able to kind of do something kind of strange for somebody my age. I was like, probably right around 50 at the time. And I really wanted to know what it was like to work in a funeral home. And so I took this like very entry level job. I was consulting part-time and working at the funeral home part-time. So it was mostly okay to make $20 an hour in this role. I mean, we kind of cut some corners and figured it out, but that was a way that I could see what it was like to lean into that landscape. And I've just really liked it. My job was to help support the funeral directors in what they needed as they're supporting these families. And I think a lot of times I was pretty surprised with what they were empowering me to do with my not a lot of experience and $20 an hour. But I think it's because I was a full-grown adult and somebody was, compassionate and had certain kinds of experiences that a lot of these funeral directors just knew it would be okay if they left me there to handle these sorts of things. And so I felt like I did see a lot and do a lot and interacted with a lot of people. But in other ways, that role, or rather that company, I guess I would say, wasn't really a values fit for me. There were things that happened there that I didn't feel that good about. And I knew it wasn't my forever home or whatever. So at a certain point, the woman who founded Recompose is named Katrina Spade, and we happened to have a couple of friends in common. So at a certain point, when I felt like I really did know that I wanted to stay in this industry or in this field, I just sent Katrina a note and said, what's going on at Recompose? Do you need somebody like me? And it just happened to work out really well because she did really need somebody to do kind of outreach work and to tell the story and to help create awareness for everything that we're doing. And my role has since sort of morphed and changed, but that's how it began.
And how long have you been with Recompose now?
Going on 2 years.
Okay. Yeah. That's a journey. It's a really cool, interesting journey. So I read through the timeline of Recompose on your website, and it sounds like Katrina, your founder, started thinking about death and mortality when her son was young. And then she did a Master of Architecture program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And her thesis in 2013 was of dirt and decomposition, proposing a place for the urban dead, which was focused on exploring a more sustainable approach to the end of life. And while Recompose evolved from that thesis and I think is broader now, it's not just for the urban dead, it's really for everybody. Her continued passion led her to a 2-year Green Fellowship where she focused on ecological death care, which led to a 2015 initial study on the natural organic reduction concept, a Kickstarter campaign, a 2016 TED Talk, which I recommend everybody listen to, and then the 2017 founding of Recompose as a public benefit corporation, a 2018 seed funding and pilot study, and the 2019 signing into law of SB 5001 by Washington Governor Jay Inslee, making Washington state the first in the world to legalize natural organic reduction, or NOR, which is defined, at least in the law, as the contained accelerated conversion of human remains to soil. And then in 2020, the company raised nearly $7 million and accepted its first bodies for recomposition in December of 2020. So it's a fascinating story, really like a whirlwind in the scheme of things. And I'd love to hear from you a little bit more about Katrina and how the company came to be and your mission, and also sort of the growth from the December of 2020, taking in your first bodies. Like, what does that look like today in terms of the numbers?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. My mind kind of goes to how Katrina would have answered that question about her childhood, because I do think it's pretty relevant. She grew up with parents who were in the medical field and were environmentalists and active in really being early voices and, kind of drawing awareness to the somewhat fragile nature of our world, really. And she, in other ways, just was kind of that kid who was in the backyard with bare feet all the time, just playing and exploring and watching what was happening to this bird that fell out of its nest, and, just very much interested in the natural world. And then later in her life, around that time that she and her partner were starting their family and that she was going to architecture school, she would have at that point really described herself as an urbanist. So somebody particularly interested in the health of cities, how do we keep our cities thriving and healthy? And when at that time, she and her partner were sort of saying, we should do our paperwork, we should get our ducks in a row, that kind of thing. And when looking at the paperwork and seeing these 2 boxes, one for cremation and one for burial, she just was very dismayed with that limited choice option there. And because of her background and because of everything she was studying and really passionate about, she thought, how could those be my only options, especially when I'm thinking about cities? Cemeteries are becoming full all the time. Our cities already have air pollution. To emit more into the atmosphere via cremation is not a good idea. And just kind of thinking, I don't want to check either of these boxes personally. And since I'm speaking with Katrina's voice again here, since I'm in architecture school and I have to do a big thesis, she decided to just look into a new form of environmental death care. So it was really that sort of student prompted, I almost want to call it bravery of just, I think, when you're kind of young and bold like that, you go, yeah, I'll just come up with a new environmental option for death care. And she really did, though. And so, yeah, it's been about, not quite 15 years since then, and lots has happened. And you asked more to the point kind of about the clients that we've been able to work with in that time. Over the, just around 4 years that we've been offering this care, cared for about 450 individuals, a third of whom have come to us in Seattle from outside of this area. So because folks know Katrina and this team as really the pioneers and the experts in this care, and because this care is really so limited in its availability around the country, we have really had that beautiful experience of caring for a lot of different people from many different places. And though that does change the carbon footprint for a person to be flown here after their death, and potentially for us to fly or truck rather their soil back to them afterwards, that's just sort of stopgap for what will be to come, knowing that eventually this care will be available to people much more widely. And if somebody wants this care now, if it makes a difference to how they feel as they're dying, if it makes a difference to their family after they've gone, to have this kind of care, then it's important to be there for them and to kind of know that we're going to catch back up with those more environmental elements as the care is more broadly available throughout the country and throughout the world.
We'll get into a whole legal discussion, which I definitely want to get into. But right now, if I live in Utah, for example, where it's not currently legal to do human composting, and I want to be, I don't know if you use the term buried, or what is the term that you use for what happens to your body with Recompose?
We say composted. We're sort of fans of calling it what it is, and it is composting. It is distinct from natural burial. So natural burial is something different than composting.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So if I live in Utah and I want to be composted and it's not currently allowed in my state, yes. I can legally, in my trust or will or something, say I would like my body to be transported to Washington State, and that's legal. I could do that.
Yeah. You don't need to die anywhere in particular or live anywhere in particular to have this care, as long as your body can make its way to us here in Seattle. We can care for you. And that does happen in a couple different ways. It is very common to transport bodies after death via airline. Many commercial flights, there will be a deceased body in carriage. And it is not totally uncommon for folks to drive their person to us. It's something that our funeral directors are happy to advise on and help folks work through if that's something that they want to do. So as long as folks can get here to us, we are able to care for them.
Okay, well, that's wonderful, because in researching for this episode, I told my husband, this is what I want to do. Yeah. And it's not currently legal in Utah, but I'm going to hopefully be able to support that effort. I don't know if you take bodies, obviously through air from other countries, but I did read in some articles that there's definitely interest from other countries.
Yeah. In talking with folks, both domestically and otherwise, about either partnering with them for some licensing partnerships, which I can talk more about, or just working with them to help advise on passing the laws. As you could imagine, Katrina was really pretty instrumental in getting the law passed here in Washington. So her expertise is requested often by others as they're moving through that legal journey. And yeah, those conversations are both domestic and international. So we've hosted folks from Australia, China, Japan, the UK, Sweden. There are people from all over who are kind of coming here and wanting to know how to bring this care to where they are. So lots of laws need to change, but particularly in areas where the government, whether it's a state government or a national government internationally, where those folks in those seats of power, where those folks are really wanting to bring in more green initiatives and are really recognizing the need for environmental action on an infrastructure level, this is a great option. It's something that, can very readily be put into place, especially through this kind of licensing partnership that we're offering folks. And it makes a huge difference. Every person that chooses human composting over burial or cremation is saving a metric ton of carbon from being emitted into the atmosphere. And that is a lot per person, but it's really a lot when we think about this becoming a widespread option for many people. And eventually we really would like to see it be as ubiquitous as cremation. And that's a long-term goal. It will take a while to get there. But again, it's what we need. I just was on a climate panel yesterday, and, those kinds of things, those kinds of conversations are both really inspiring and really disheartening, because a lot of things need to change. A lot of things really need to change. And in this sector of our lives, in the sector of death care, in this area of our experience as humans, we've got a really good offer. We've got a really good solution, and it's got a huge impact. So.
Well, I would love to hear about the licensing and affiliations that you're doing and what that looks like. Is it I know you did a lot of studies on the actual process, which I'm guessing was part of how the law was passed, because those studies show, that it's actually good for the earth and that you're remediating whatever needs to be remediated, et cetera. So is the licensing for the process, the scientific process, and or the holistic process? And I want to talk about your laying in ceremony and talk a little bit about religion as well. But love to hear what you're doing with the affiliation, because I think in licensing, I think that would make it much easier for states or countries or municipalities to adopt this. It was a decade or more of work for Katrina,
Yeah.
and she can share that with people.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So that licensing program, what it gets folks who have the aptitude and the experience and also the values and the frame of mind to offer this in the way that we really think it needs to be offered, in terms of thinking about humans as well as the earth. That program is about getting folks access to all of our data and everything that we know about this science. And that goes back to, like you're saying, some of those initial studies that we did. And the really important, impactful study that happened was with a soil scientist named Dr. Lynn Carpenter Boggs, works for one of our state universities here. And farmers have a regular, long-standing practice of composting their animals. So she's been working with farmers to create safe soil, to create safe environments, to do the right thing with their animals after death. So Katrina and her were able to connect and just transfer that to the human animal that we are.
Yeah.
And so from there forward, and even from before that, there's so much learning about the safety of soil and how we can best create the conditions for that with the plant materials that we use. We use wood chips, alfalfa, and straw. Composting is all about carbons and nitrogens. And our body is the nitrogen, and the carbon is supplied by, right now in Seattle, wood chips, alfalfa, and straw. But as we do expand, maybe in Mexico, that would be a completely different trio of plant materials, as it would be in Sweden,
Right.
as it would be, so those materials are readily available here in the Northwest, and that's great, and that's what we use, but we can get carbon from lots of different places. But getting back to this licensing idea, it's all of that information, all of that knowledge, all of the data that we have for caring for 450 people and what we've learned in that process. Each individual teaches us something about this process. And it's also access to the vessels that we use. We have our own vessels that we care for folks in, and they're both beautiful on their outside and really efficient on their inside. And they're manufactured in the Midwest. And so folks that are working with us have access to that as well. And just even, down to the plans for the building and how to create the spaces that you're going to need as this type of funeral home.
So to date, like today, how many of these licensing agreements do you have? Like, how widespread is it becoming currently?
So everything's still kind of in a hypothetical or ongoing phase. So yeah, we haven't inked any of those deals yet, but there is somebody here who's most of her job is working with those folks and having conversations. I think I was just kind of talking to somebody about the nature of startups, and in many ways we can think of Recompose as a startup, but the typical pace of a startup is like, breakneck. You just go forward quickly and figure it out as you go. And this is not really that. It's much more careful and deliberate. We're talking about human lives and the human experience. So it's not move fast and break things, as we hear about with a lot of tech companies and a lot of startups. It is go slow and think about the implications, and all of that really matters. So.
Yeah, I love that. That makes a lot of sense. Well, I'd love to dive in a little bit more to the scientific side of the Recompose process. So my understanding is that Katrina felt our bodies have nutrients and became enamored with the idea that our bodies, once deceased, contributing to the growth and support of new life, rather than, as she talked about in her TED Talk, the last act being a toxic act.
Yeah.
And I read this 2015 New York Times article by Katrine Einhorn that's on your website, and she describes it this way. The process is surprisingly simple. Place nitrogen-rich material like dead animals or like our bodies, the human animal, like you said, inside a mound of carbon-rich material like wood chips and sawdust, adding moisture or extra nitrogen and making other adjustments as needed. Microbial activity will start the pile cooking. Bacteria release enzymes that break down tissue into component parts like amino acids, and eventually the nitrogen-rich molecules bind with the carbon-rich molecules, creating a soil-like substance. The article also notes the temperatures reach around 140 degrees, often higher, and that heat kills common pathogens, and notes that when done correctly, which I know is how you guys do it, there should be no smell and no bones, even though that takes longer than tissue. So I don't know if you want to update that or give us a little bit more. And I'm also interested in like, how long does it take for one human body to become soil?
Yeah. Yeah. So I would just edit some of that information. The composting process does not break down bones. So
Okay.
the bones are handled separately and differently. And I will just take a minute to note that cremation also does not allow the bones to fully break down. So there are not very many ways that you can compare composting and cremation, but in this one way, in that we both have to mechanically reduce the bones, that is one action that we have to take after the composting process. So the process happens in 2 stages. It happens first in an active composting vessel for 5 to 7 weeks. And then there is a sorting process. In that 5 to 7 weeks, that's when we're seeing those high temperatures created not because of our interventions, but because of that microbial action. All of that kind of breaking down of pathogens is happening in that 5 to 7 weeks inside the active composting vessel. And then when we take the soil, what is then soil, out of the vessel after those 5 to 7 weeks, we have a sorting process. So we're going to be sorting out anything that was surgically implanted, everything from a breast implant to a hip replacement joint. Things like hip replacement joints can be recycled, which is good. And then bones are also sorted out in that process, and the bones are mechanically reduced. And luckily, they're full of lots of great calcium and phosphorus, minerals like that. And that is stuff that we really know works well for growing things. Many people buy bone meal for their gardens, right? So we take that reduced bone material, it's like a sandy texture at that point, and integrate it back into the soil, mix it in really well into the soil.
Do you take the bones once you've made them into the sandy material and put them back with the other composting for that individual? Like if somebody wanted to pick up a bag of soil and it was their loved one, would that go back in that bag for them?
The bone material is mixed back into the compost.
Okay. I think some people that would be important for them. And that is one of the things Katrina talked about, potential additional remediation for things like fillings and hip replacements and things like that. What about if somebody had chemotherapy before they died or some kind of other toxic substance in their body? How do you remediate that?
Yeah, so a lot of that is broken down in that high heat for a sustained period of time. So in that active composting phase, when the temperature is going up, oftentimes to about 150 degrees and staying there for as long as a week, those harmful pathogens and harmful chemicals, many of them are being broken down. And so there's a lot of testing that happens. In particular, this is kind of a piece of science that, maybe most of us can wrap our head around. Salmonella is kind of a bellwether for bacteria and pathogens. And when you test for salmonella and you find that there is none, you are assured that there is also none of many other compounds and chemicals and pathogens. And so we do lots of testing, but salmonella is one of them. And you know that you're clear on many other things as well. Our soil absolutely meets the EPA guidelines for what safe soil is. So as we know more, we can work more with the EPA and with our soil scientists and with others to see what else we can do there. But I think that's kind of all of society, all of science working together now. I think that's what's really challenging about some of those studies that we read about in the New York Times or whatever is a lot of it is really new science that we're still figuring out what it means and what to do about it. But
Yeah.
this is soil that, the reason that it got passed in Washington state, the reason that it gets passed in the 12 other states that have, 11 other 12 total states that have the law is because this soil meets the EPA guidelines for what safe soil is.
Okay. And in terms of the regulation, is that done? I'm assuming that right now you've got the EPA on a federal level and then you have the state laws. So do you have to test? I imagine are you testing every single body that composts, or is it done like so many per 100? And do you have to give those data back to the state or the federal government? How does that work?
Yeah, some of each. So the funeral industry is state regulated. So as far as I know, it's all state regulations and guidelines and checkpoints. But when we first opened, there was a really heavy presence of, I believe it was folks from the Board of Health. There are a couple of different regulating agencies, but the Board of Health is a big one, who were here, once a week. And then after you pass 10 weeks of those tests, then they're going to come every other week. And then after 10 weeks of that, they're going to come once a month. And then they're not going to come anymore, except for they're going to surprise you 2 times a year, and they'll show up and want to test this, that, and the other, and then they're gone again. So that's one side of what the testing looks like. And then there is in-house testing that we're constantly doing. And yeah, with pretty much every individual, there is a run of tests that our operators want to undertake to know for sure that, and really just to satisfy their ongoing curiosity around, maybe this one person had something slightly different that we hadn't handled before. Maybe we knew something about the way they died and we were curious to see about a specific molecule or compound, whether it would be present in any way at the end of the experience, whether it changes the pH level or whether it makes certain nutrients mute or extra, so there's a lot of testing and science that goes on, both documenting the safety as well as just our ongoing knowledge to understand how do we do this as efficiently as possible, and how do we do it as safely as possible. And again, kind of we learn something from every individual that we care for. So it's just wanting to take advantage of our time interacting with that person to see what they want us to know about this process.
Yeah. Do you have an intake form? Maybe you can just describe the process. So let's say I decide I would like to be composted at Recompose. Can I start that process at any age? Like, I don't know when I'm going to die. I mean, obviously there's some people who know that they're sick, and some people just make that decision and they even, hopefully it's years and years away. Yeah. Can you just walk us through what that process looks like? Is there an intake form that says I have these fillings and I've had chemotherapy that's sort of the technical side of it, but also I'm interested in the more spiritual side of it and just sort of what that process looks like for an individual.
Yeah, it's great if we could know as much as possible about what that person went through in terms of, did they have chemotherapy? Were they dying for the last 6 months and kind of had almost nothing to eat for the last month? Or, was this somebody who died really suddenly in a car accident after having a 3-course meal? It's good to know those things, but we don't always get to know them, and it's not vital to know them. And in terms of hip replacements, I mean, we'll find that out when we go through that sorting process. We'll know. So it's not necessary to know that ahead of time. And I think, there's lots of ways that it can unfold. Families that we work with, some of them, may be so distraught that they're just nowhere near being ready to kind of share more about their person's, past 2, 3, 4, 5 months. But there may be some folks who are for different reasons are really able to talk about what that is. And so we'll get that information when it's available. But again, it's not vital for us to know. our greenhouse operators can stay nimble and stay flexible and make different accommodations as things move along if they're seeing different changes in heat and things like that. So, and then on the other side of your question is this idea around how does one kind of decide that they want to prepare for having this kind of care at the end of their life. And most funeral homes do have a pre-arrangement program, and our pre-arrangement program is called Recompose. So maybe I'll stop there and just make sure that it is really clear for everybody that we are a full service funeral home. So sometimes it's easy to kind of get lost in this, all the new parts of the composting itself. And it can get sort of buried that we do all the work that a traditional funeral home would do. It's just that our manner of disposition is quite different. So we have funeral directors here on staff, and they do death certificates, and we have refrigeration, and we hold people there until they're ready to be placed in the vessel and all of these things. We have a space for celebrations. We have beautiful ceremonies here. And so again, most funeral homes will offer some kind of pre-arrangement program. And with Recompose, you're doing a couple different things. You're locking in today's price. The price is $7,000 and it will go up. Was something lower when we first started, and it will become higher as we go on. But you're locking in today's price, and there are a couple of documents that go with the program that allow you to make some decisions now about what you want later, and also to document some important information that's necessary for things like death certificates, so that somebody later doesn't have to say, what was Ashley's mom's maiden name? That kind of thing. Also in those documents is choosing something called a designated agent, which is really important. That's the person who's legally responsible for carrying out your wishes. So you can say on your whatever kind of paperwork you're doing, I want human composting at Recompose, but unless you have named a designated agent, which is different than a power of attorney, unless you have got that designated agent documented, there's no legal framework for carrying out your wishes, and your next of kin can make a different decision. And so that pre-composed pathway is mostly concerned with the legal documents that are necessary and pieces of information that will help our funeral directors and our process in general. But it's a really great program. I hear as much that people are relieved to have that financial part underway as they're very happy to have the documents in place and to know that that's there for their survivors. I think there are many people who have had to navigate somebody's death where they didn't know what that person wanted, and they didn't know that person's mother's maiden name, and they didn't have anybody in place that was the natural go-to person to deal with everything. And it just becomes, it ruins families sometimes. So it's a really, anybody that's come close to that scenario is very vocal about how happy they are to have, in particular, and to have their pre-composed membership taken care of. But yeah, it's both a subscription in that you can choose $100, $250, or $500 a month to pay. Many people also choose to just pay it off all at once.
And right now, and I don't know if you could talk about how this differs from what you experienced at the conventional funeral home, like what is the age at which people are making the pre-composed decision? Is it mostly older when they're closer to death, or is it a mix?
Yeah, it's a mix. And that is one of my favorite things. We have as many people under 62 in that program as there are over 62. And it is totally normal for me to be in the database pulling up a record, and I come across somebody's birth year of 1995 or something. And it would be just unheard of 50 years ago for somebody in their 30s to be planning for their end of life care. Just not something that happened. And I think that, without having spoken to every 20 or 30-year-old that is in that program, I think that what that is people who are really big advocates of the environment and who see this for the awesome solution that it is. And they recognize this team as really being leaders, and they want to be a part of it. They want to support it. And hey, if you can afford $100 a month to be a part of something and to support it and to pay into it and to chip away at your end of life care, probably saving a lot of money in the long run. And And it's probably something that brings people a lot of, feels good to be involved in that way. And I'll just add too, that money. So we take just 10%. So if you're on $100 a month plan, we're taking $10 a month, and the $90 remaining is going to sit in a bank account that we can't touch until that person dies. So any member can decide to have their money back at any time if they choose.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is so interesting about the 30-year-olds. Is that different from what you saw at the conventional funeral home?
Well, I guess I wasn't involved in pre-arrangement programs there,
Okay.
but when I think about the funerals that we had, unfortunately, I would say, yeah, the young are not safe from death, and I've
Right.
unfortunately attended a lot of funerals and worked at a lot of funerals for younger people. But I guess I would say that I can see how, personally in the lives of many people that come to Recompose, this is something that is really important to them because of them being hikers, gardeners, outdoor type people. And it is really just cuts across age and every other kind of demographic factor. I always kind of say, if you put 10 random people on a wall and said, okay, pick out the one that's really interested in human composting and pick out the one that's really against human composting, I really don't know that you would be able to do it, because there's just no one archetype for it. It's just lots of different kinds of people.
When do you spend the most time with the people you love? For us, it's at home, around the dinner table with family, or sipping cocktails in the living room with friends. So why not make that time even more meaningful by imbuing your gatherings with pieces that not only make connecting easier, but spark conversation around your table. Amaton's collection of small batch, artisan, quality-made pieces for tabletop and home are not only made for simple serving, they're works of art designed for daily use. Whether you're hosting a dinner party or sitting down for family game night, our collections create a sense of presence and peace in every home. Shop our collection of dinnerware, drinkware, serveware, and more at amatond.com. That's AMEATENDRE.com. Gather by design.
As part of this series that I'm doing on death and dying, I'm talking to a palliative care doctor. And one of the things that I feel like is so important is our preparation for death. I mean, death is literally the most inevitable thing. And very few of us talk about it or plan for it until we're much closer to it. So I think that there's a huge benefit. And I wonder if you guys maybe at some point will do a survey with the younger people who have joined Recompose. I think that they will also get peace out of it from the planning. So just the fact that you're taking the time to think enough about it to actually decide to join this program, and you're thinking about what will happen to you when you're dead, I think helps a lot with the process as you approach death, whether you know it's coming or not. And I think that that's an added benefit to that program. Beyond the environmental benefits to human composting, Katrina has also talked about the spiritual benefit, specifically that connecting death to the cycle of nature will help people face their own mortality and bring comfort to the bereaved. And I agree with that. So we were talking earlier about reading, and I just finished Crossing to Safety by Wallace Stegner, which was given to me by a very good friend, Linda Boudet. It is a wonderful book, and I highly recommend it to everybody. And there was this passage that I read just a day or two ago by a character who's dying from cancer. And she says, "It's as natural as being born. And even if we stop being the individuals we once were, there's an immortality of organic molecules that's absolutely certain. Don't you find that a wonderful comfort? I do. To think that we'll become part of the grass and trees and animals, that will stay right here where we loved it while we were alive. People will drink us with their morning milk and pour us as maple syrup over their breakfast pancakes." Mm-hmm. So I say we should be happy and grateful and make the most of it. I've had a wonderful life. I've loved every minute. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the spiritual side? So I read on your website about your laying in ceremony. I'd love to hear about that. And then also, can people bring religious leaders in to have ceremonies? How do you kind of work that? And then also the part of religions, like some religions, like the Jewish religion, which I'm from, you're supposed to be buried within 24 hours. So I know different religions have different death rituals. How do you work with people on the spiritual side and the religious side?
Yeah, sure. So we have a really beautiful space here called the Gathering Space, which is where we do our services and our ceremonies. We actually have another really cool space too called Cedar, which is a smaller space. And maybe if we have time, we'll talk about some of the things that we offer there. But our main services area is called the Gathering Space. And it is available to whomever it is that families and communities would like to sort of preside over that. So certainly we've had rabbis and ministers of faith, and sometimes it's the kind of witchy Aunt Sarah or something who's going to come in and lead the service. It's that's great by us if families have somebody that is very meaningful and matters in their community. But another thing that is really unique to us is that all of our 3 of our 4 funeral directors are trained celebrants as well. So that is a service that, going back to my prior experience, I don't think any of those funeral directors would have liked to lead the service. They're more kind of behind the scenes types in general in that field. But these are all folks who have that experience and a really beautiful ability to deliver and prepare a beautiful ceremony. And the ceremony that they offer is based on the carbon cycle. So it's kind of like what you just read, that beautiful passage that you just read. And a little bit of a science lesson woven in and out, a little bit of here's what's going on molecularly, but also, very spiritual and very, very earth-based, kind of goes through the elements of air and fire and water. And there's even, these moments where they're kind of breathing together, and woven in and through all of that are other typical things that you might find that we all tend to kind of love about funerals, with kind of the remembrances where people come up and give their memories and share really meaningful moments. Almost always a slideshow, it's so beautiful to see somebody's life and images in that moment, and probably a soundtrack that goes along with that, a playlist that somebody made. And so those ceremonies are very meaningful. I'll never forget the first time I was there to see it. And 2 of the things that are additionally very unique to us, in addition to that carbon-based cycle, there are some things that happen with the body during the service that are, again, kind of very unique to us at Recompose. So during the service, the body is laid on something that we call a cradle, and they're going to be wrapped in a shroud at that time and kind of nested with that wood chips, alfalfa, and straw material. And at the end of the service, families invited to come up to the cradle and lay more plant material. So it could be that the funeral directors would prepare some baskets with more of that wood chips, alfalfa, and straw, but also families can bring in plant material that, is meaningful or would have been meaningful to that person or to their family. And one of the examples I like to give is I was talking to a man, when his partner died. I asked him, what was it that you all put on Wayne's cradle? And he told me that Wayne had a fern for 45 years, just all through his life, had been kind of caring for this one fern. And so he took some cuttings from the fern and brought them in and placed them on the cradle with him. And, idea being that these kind of meaningful plant matter is going to go into the composting process with this person. And, I think my husband would know to cut some roses from the backyard and maybe the irises if they were out, and so it's like that. And so community is able to add that plant material. And then also there's something in that room called a threshold vessel, which looks a lot like the active composting vessels, kind of a fraternal twin maybe to those active composting vessels. And what it is really kind of a doorway or a hallway or like a portal, if you will, from the gathering space into the greenhouse. And family is able to kind of help the funeral directors to pass the body through that passageway, kind of helping to deliver them or guide them into the next space.
That's beautiful. And you have an image on your website that I think shows that, and it's really beautiful. So I recommend people go look at it.
Yeah.
And while I'm thinking about it, so at the end of the process, whether I think it's, whatever, probably 10 to 12 weeks-ish all in. So either somebody can come back and pick up the soil and they can use it in their own space, or you also, I read, have an agreement with, I don't know if it's a farm or some open tract of land where the soil can also be laid. So that's a choice people have.
Yeah. So there's kind of two main choices and then sort of a sum of each choice in between. So yeah, there's a cubic yard of soil that is made in this process. So that's about what fits in the back of a truck. It's a decent amount of soil that comes from each of our body's process. And so if families want, we can package all of that up into some smaller double-walled paper bags that are very easy to move and share and put in the back of a station wagon and bring them over to Cousin Billy's or whatever that looks like. If a family wants all of that person's soil in those bags, it's about 25, 30, 40 bags, depending. So quite a lot and enough to share for sure. And then on the other side of that maybe is this land donation program. So right now we have 3 land partners. These are all nonprofits that are doing conservation or reforestation work. These are people that have a state or federally regulated trust deed of some kind on the land that they're working with. They're very structured, well-organized systems of folks that are working together to either, let's say, conserve a wetlands and say, we're going to take care of this land and make sure that it's the ecosystem that it needs to be and that nobody builds a strip mall here. There's another area where a land was improperly logged in the 30s and 40s and didn't get back to its state because of that bad logging. So they're doing reforestation work there. So what I want you to hear here is very meaningful projects. It's so much more than kind of just putting the soil somewhere. This soil is really going to work for all of our environment, right? And so what a lot of families do is take some of the soil. Maybe all the cousins are going to, plant a tree, or maybe all the neighbors are going to use it in their rose gardens, and maybe that's 12 to 15 of those bags that I mentioned, and maybe then the rest is donated to one of those land partners. But, it's been very common to talk to folks who sort of say, I don't want there to be a place that my family feels like they have to go and stand there and cry. I just want my soul to go back out into the world. And so they see the land donation as perfect for that. And I'll just maybe mention too that the land donation program isn't set up for visitors. So there's nothing wrong with either way. It's very much is really, what do you want for your experience?
And could somebody, let's say they took some of the bags and they donated some, could they take some of the soil and put it in some small thing to keep in their house, or is that not a good idea because of the soil?
Yeah. It's possible to keep some soil. Yeah, there's some things to think about. You'd want it to be as dry as possible. You want to give it some time to any moisture to evaporate. There are definitely some considerations just so that you don't end up with mold and feel really disappointed down the line. But compost is alive, and so we want to think about that. But there are ways to kind of discourage any kind of further organic matter in the soil.
Yeah.
And our funeral directors would help somebody think through that. And it's also maybe worth mentioning that, there are a lot of people that somebody already paid for their burial plot or their place in a mausoleum or their niche, and for an urn to go or something like that for ashes. And I know that there are people that use their soil that way as well.
Okay.
And so
Interesting.
they'll say, I want to be on this wall with everybody else.
Well, I want to kind of paint the contrast now to the current two methods of burial as compared to what you're doing at Recompose. And I did a little bit of research, and then also after reading the New York Times article, and I wanted to just talk about that a little bit. So in this 2015 New York Times article, Katrine Einhorn notes that conventional burial is anything but natural, and that our death rituals in the United States have evolved pretty dramatically in a relatively short period of time. And I found this so interesting. So here's a very brief history on death rituals in the United States. So cadavers being preserved with embalming fluid containing formaldehyde, which is a carcinogen, began in the Civil War when Northern families needed to get their loved ones, their dead men, home from the South. And then apparently the embalming of President Abraham Lincoln after his assassination in 1865 also played a significant role in popularizing the practice in our country. And Katrina noted in her TED Talk, which was in 2016, so I'm sure the number is higher now, there was enough embalming fluid used in our dead to fill 8 Olympic-sized pools, and that's toxic material. Embalming chemicals leach into the soil. They can negatively affect soil health and biodiversity, impacting microorganisms in plant life. Groundwater contamination from cemeteries can pose significant health risks to nearby communities that rely on well water. And then on the other side, the other common choice in the United States is cremation, which became more prevalent in the mid-20th century due to a number of factors, including cost, space, and land limitations in some geographies, flexibility of what to do with ashes, and a rise in secularism and a decline in religious objections. Cremation, however, uses a lot of energy, heating bodies between 1400 and 1800 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 to 2 hours and using 15 to 30 gallons of natural gas and releasing over 500 pounds of carbon dioxide, which is equivalent, according to ChatGPT anyway, to driving a car 500 miles. So it is abundantly clear that green burial is so much better for the earth than the leading forms of death rituals in the United States. And though the methods of death rituals have changed relatively quickly, I also read in that article, and I do think this has changed, but I'm sure some of it has not, that there's some repulsion to the concept of green burial and natural organic reduction. In this article in 2015, one critic wrote, "A pile of bodies is usually called a mass grave. Please stop what you're doing." Of course, you're not doing this multiple bodies at a time. You're doing it in a very singular way. And I think it's just, we have a hard time with change as humans, and especially when it comes to our loved ones and death, which is a subject we're so loath to talk and think about.
Yeah, I would say, I very rarely hear anything but loving acceptance and excitement. We don't hear from a lot of folks that are opposed to it. It's just, maybe there are people that are having those conversations, and that are, certainly there are, from time to time I'll hear from folks who say, well, I'm trying to get my family on board, but, maybe it's religious beliefs or, different ideas that they might have. We hear from people that, that maybe the most common comment is like, it just makes sense. This just makes sense. All the way down to kind of more and more particulars around, just never, the other options didn't ever, register for them. It wasn't, they just couldn't imagine, I didn't want either of those things. And so they're just so glad to have another option. And I do a lot of our outreach work. That's really what a lot of my job is. And we show up in different kinds of ways. We do a lot of conventions, home and garden conventions. So every year in January, there's a big home and garden convention here in Seattle. This convention center is just packed with all these dahlia bulb lovers and people that are, canning their jalapeno jelly and all of these things. And as they cycle through all of the booths, we're there just sort of sharing about this. And it's really great because these are people that truly understand the miracle of composting. They're doing it in their backyard, and they know for certain that at that level, death is already becoming new life. And they see that in their gardens. And so it makes a lot of sense to them.
I love the garden convention.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of that, but that seems like a perfect fit. I want to spend a little bit of time on the legal landscape for green burial in the United States. So on your website, I saw that since Washington state legalized NOR, there are now 12 states that have legalized the process, some to take effect in future years. And I also know that you support legislative advocacy in other states. So can you talk a little bit about what does that advocacy support look like? Like I saw, for example, I live in Utah and that there's a bill in Utah. So what do you do to support people advocating? And then like, what can individuals, like what could I do to support it in my own state?
Yeah, well, it's so often been kind of a grassroots sort of a thing. So the playbook that Katrina kind of outlined by virtue of her experience is really about getting a group of citizens together and finding a legislator in your neighborhood, in your region, in your city, in your town, and finding a legislator who's got a record for going for environmental infrastructure ordinances and laws, and say, that person knows how to navigate the process. They know what to do. So if you can inspire them and say, hey, do you know about this yet? Because we really want it. If you can inspire a lawmaker, you're done, because they want to have great projects to work on. I mean, imagine they all, maybe their desk is full of parking lots and, this highway that needs to connect to that highway or whatever. Maybe they're not as interesting as something like this. And if you can get them to look into and to get educated on what this is, hopefully that's going to light, a really bright trail to them getting all of their colleagues on board. And our legislative advocacy pages on our website, it's just right there on the main menu. It says legislative advocacy. We list the particular bills whenever we know them. So, there are these funny series of letters and numbers, and just saying this is what it was in Vermont and this is what it was in New York. And so that people can go and look up those laws, and legislators in particular know what they're looking for when they look up those bills that have already passed. And to just provide that framework of the order of events and how it's worked so far and what other state governments are on their way.
Okay. Really cool. Well, I just wanted to add a couple of quotes from the TED Talk that really struck me. One is, Katrina said, the truth is that nature is really, really good at death. In nature, death creates life. And I think, like you said, for so many people, it just is like obvious when you hear that. But I think the more that we embrace it, the more peace we can have as we plan for death. And then the other idea is for supportive staff to be on hand to help families with the care and the preparation of loved ones' bodies. We're banishing practices that bewilder and disempower and creating a system that is beautiful and meaningful and transparent. Before I get to my last 5 questions that I ask everybody, is there anything that you would like to add for listeners about what you're doing at Recompose that I haven't brought up, that you feel like it's important to talk about, whether it's memorable stories or misconceptions or environmental benefits or anything that I've missed?
I think one thing that I would like to add is that I want folks to know that we do these really great virtual tours. So even if you're not in Seattle and you can't come in for an in-person tour, we do these great virtual tours where I do my darndest to make you feel like you're in the building. We go around through all the spaces and talk about how we use those spaces and how and why we do the work that we do, and get into what it means to be a part of all of this. And there's always time for question and answer at the end, which is really great. The opportunity to really kind of ask that specific question. And I think they're a great resource for people.
Wonderful. Well, at the end of every episode, I like to ask my guests the same 5 questions to round out the discussion. So my first question is, as we explore in my brand, Âme Attend, which, by the way, is French for to take care of your soul, objects can hold a lot of meaning for us, and they can tie us to the past, enable us to enjoy the present more, or even take us into the future. Can you share an object from your life, whether you still have it or not, that holds a lot of meaning for you, and tell us why?
The first thing that I think of is my dad was a marine biologist, and he was just a very funny guy. And we lived in Australia when I was a kid, and he was an underwater diver. And as a biologist, always needed to document what he was seeing. And so he built a underwater camera casing out of like lucite and things like that. And it's got like it's like a Rube Goldberg machine. It's got like, this funny dial that's then connected to this small metal rod, which is what would turn the camera film advancer, which is going to sound like Greek to somebody who's never used a film camera. It was not the age of iPhones, right? So in its prime placement in the living room, it looks like a robot or something. It's just this odd little clear plastic thing that you wonder about. And I can't say why, but it just means so much to us both. It's like just encapsulates this weird man that my dad was. And it's just cool. It's just a funny little artifact of life in the 70s.
I love it. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Can you share a favorite tradition? It could be something from when you were a child or something you do today with your husband or your family. It could revolve around food or someplace you go, anything at all.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that the thing that comes to mind, my husband and I have had a couple of traditions, and we've realized that sometimes the traditions stop and they make room for a new tradition. For many years, we had this thing called a pink party, which was in celebration of this giant blossoming pink cherry tree in our backyard. Everybody wore pink. Everybody brought pink food. It was like, okay, what can I, add beet juice to make this thing pink? And it was a very cool party, but eventually it just kind of petered out. And over the last 10 years, we've had a tradition of this road trip every June. And this last June, we went on the road trip, and we both knew it wasn't feeling the same. And we came home and, didn't want to say it while we were out there, but we came home and said, I think maybe that was the last road trip. And I guess I would say I recognize this pattern in us of loving a tradition, but not needing for it to be forever, that there's no less meaning in something that happens for 7 years or 10 years or 12 years and then fades and makes room for something else to come in.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Are you in a phase in your life where you enjoy entertaining in your home? Why or why not?
I love the idea of it, and I love all of the things that are in your world. I love the linen napkins and mixing and matching all of these things. And secret life of me is that I once edited a wedding magazine. So I like tabletop scapes. I mean, I've had a couple of different careers in my career, but I really love all of that. And I love having people over, and I love theoretically like meal planning and thinking of, what I would serve. But for some reason, it hasn't happened a lot lately in the last couple of years. Maybe I just never kind of came back to it after those heavy years of COVID, or maybe it's like those traditions that I mentioned, that it's just not quite alive in my life right now. And I think I've been trying to do more low key. Like I have a couple of friends where we're picnickers, and we'll each kind of just bring snacks and meet at some park and make a very cute little arrangement on the side of a hill somewhere, but nobody has to host. And, I think that's kind of where I'm at maybe for entertaining right now.
Well, I think, and I've talked about this with other guests, like we have seasons in our lives for all kinds of things. And sometimes it's inviting people into our home, and sometimes it's going on a picnic. Yeah. Really, to me, it's, the focus is on gathering and just being with other people. So it sounds like you're doing more of it sort of with friends outside the home at the moment. And I'm sure there will be a season where it comes back into your home as well. Do you have one or two top resources, books or websites, podcasts, anything that you can recommend? Could be related to death care or just anything. I know you said you love to read, so we love putting recommendations in the show notes for people's favorites.
Yeah. The last two books that I read, I was doing that thing where I was reading them both, is it a this book day or a that book day? And they were both so good, and they worked really well together. One was called Heaven is a Place on Earth, and it's not a death care book, but it's by Adrienne Shirk, Shirk. And this is a younger-ish writer who's kind of a radical in a way, but also just like a literature teacher and somebody who is sort of has that journalistic heart and just wants to discover things. And she's very interested in utopias. And so the book goes along through her life as she's young and married, and her husband's dad has a stroke and they're taking care of him, and they're trying to figure out how to, are they ever going to be able to buy a house? And all of these things are, it's kind of, you're in her life while she is undertaking this big research around current and past utopias that have existed in this country. And this is everything from like the Shakers to like, the family and these kind of radical groups that happened in the 70s. And she goes to these sites and visits them and is thinking through what that means and what it means for somebody of a relatively privileged class to think about trying to wrap your arms around something like that, and thinking about doing that on land that was formerly and could by all means still be cared for by Indigenous people, and in a kind of lifestyle that really reflects those values and that way of living. And what does that mean to go back to that kind of life as colonizers? It's like a really interesting book. There's so much happening at any one time in terms of the stories that she's bringing together. It was just awesome. I loved that book. And then at the same time, I was reading a book called Having and Being Had by a writer named Eula Biss, which is Biss. And this is a book. She's definitely a poet who has, like, some of her publications have just been poetry. And so she writes in this very short form and I'm not going to say poetic, but there's something very kind of lyrical there. There's something very imaginative. Each of the short chapters kind of leads into the next, almost like a nesting doll or something. Like the last idea of that chapter leads perfectly into the next idea of the first one. And she's exploring ownership, having things, and what it means to have things and to be part of a society where having things is such a core part of our experience. And she's just such a great writer that's just such a pleasure to be kind of swept up into it. And I'll also mention that I did see in more on theme, I started watching a great little series on Amazon the other night called Feet First. I believe that's what it's called. And it is about a filmmaker who started with her parents' own decisions to do medical aid in dying. It's not legal everywhere, but the first 1 or 2 episodes is about her mom and her dad, who each chose, because of cancer, in fairly rapid succession, to have that agency and ownership over their last days and what that looked like. And so I just find that fascinating. And I think we're going to see more and more of that medical aid and dying in our communities. And I want to be ready to understand more about what that means for people.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Love those recommendations. And my last question is, what do you do for yourself? Do you have a practice, a focus, a habit, or daily routine that you adhere to that contributes to your success and or your well-being?
Yeah, I think I have some really amazing friends. I think one of the most healing things for me is to just be in deep connective conversation with people. And I have great friends that will indulge that, and that we can just kind of sit for hours and spelunk around and think about things and try to figure things out. And that's, I think, maybe one of the main ways that I feel nourished. And I have, some of those kind of traditional or common things like taking a bath and reading in a hammock and going for a walk. But I think it's really my close ones, my loved ones, that give me the most. I'm a talker, I'm a communicator, I'm a listener. And I get the most care out of just caring for others and allowing myself to be cared for.
Thank you. I love what you are doing. As I told you, I told my husband, this is what I want to do. I feel so good about it. And again, I really do think people can find peace with the planning, as well as taking care of our environment if they choose Recompose or green burial. So Thank you so much. Can you just remind everybody one more time where to find Recompose?
Yeah, recompose.life. So instead of a .com, we're a .life. On Instagram, it's at Recompose Life. We have a monthly newsletter just once a month, not too often. And if you have any questions, send us an email at info@recompose.life.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening. It helps us reach more people who just might need these conversations. If you have ideas for future guests or have feedback, you can reach out to us by visiting onthetablewithashley.com, linked in the show notes. On the Table with Ashley is presented by our elevated everyday home brand, Amatand, which you can find at amatand.com. That's AMEATENDRE.com. You can follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Amatand. And you can learn more about products related to the Death and Dying series at amatand.com.